Michael, what's up,
Awesome.
man? Thanks for your patience. How can we help you?
Yeah. So I've listened. I actually stumbled on to y'all's podcast just recently, and I've listened to some other discussions like this. And something that's always kind of struck me and frustratingly is that when Christians seem to come on these shows or any shows, they're usually what we might call the right-wing Christians. And they're the ones who are trying to argue that there is proof for God in some sort of way. And of course, you guys are often arguing there is not proof for God. But there's this whole other section of Christianity, of this belief that might be called the progressive or the progressive left or any number of things like that, that don't interpret the gospel the same way and come at it at a very different way. And I don't feel like that voice is really ever being heard. So, of course, people think Christians are, frankly, a little nutty because they're, they come from that right-wing side that might more accurately be described as a little bit more legalistic in their interpretation, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
and I would just like to offer that there is a whole nother way of looking at it.
Okay, well, I want to and Michael, I really appreciate you calling in, and I'm not trying to I don't want to suppress what you're saying, but I'm gonna stave away from or stave off from calling right-wing people nutty. I don't want to characterize everybody that way. I think people that have conservative views might have valid reasons for some of their views, and maybe they're not nutty. But I can tell you that I've taken some nutty calls. And so there I can agree with you. But I agree. I mean,
right.
there is an untapped kind of opinion, I think, or point of view from people who consider themselves more left, more liberal, that don't often speak out about their Christianity. And I think that conservatives are often given the title of, well, Christian, or Christians are pigeonholed to being conservative, but there is a large population of liberals and progressives that are very much Christian. I'm in New York City, and I am in a very liberal city where there is Christianity everywhere. So it shouldn't be assigned to kind of one group, if you will, or another. But it is very much all across the board, touches all kinds of people. But yeah, there are different perspectives. So what is the perspective that you wanted to put forth? What do you have to say that's different from some of these quote unquote nutty callers you might hear us take?
Yeah. And yeah, like you said, I apologize for that. I certainly actually have a respect for most of some of the right-wing side people. It's just the ones that are, like you said, you take some callers they say some things that you go, hang on, that doesn't make any sense. And it's because they're trying to argue logically something they're trying to argue it like a scientist would, and you can't do that with faith. It really, for me, I was agnostic until I was 21. It happened in college for me where I went to, I just kind of got an itching to understand a little bit more. My campus minister was very much into astronomy, and we talked about science a lot. And what I discovered in that environment was a group of people who were very much dedicated to one another, loved each other, supported each other, a great deal of compassion. Did not matter who you were, what walk of life, or how strange or different, or how much you thought that you were on the outskirts of our society, of our culture. You were welcome in our place. And that kind of devotion and love and support, I saw how that lifted us up and made us better people. And I don't think anybody would deny that that's possible. We attribute that to the presence of God.
Okay.
And it's not necessarily because of evidence. It's because of a feeling that we got.
Well, I understand that.
And I don't think that sort of thing. Yeah, I don't. Go ahead.
I want to ask you something. Okay. So, in with respect to the topic of today's show, Sofia and I, we wanted to talk about women in religion. And I want to know what you have to say about women should keep silent in churches. They are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission. So that's 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 35. And so I get it. A loving and accepting sect or point of view when it comes to Christianity is what you represent. But how do you reconcile this newfound view with commands from essentially your God or your deity or the people interpreting his commands, saying that women are unequal to men?
The way that we reconcile that is by recognizing that fallible people were trying their best to interpret God's message within the context of their times. And the context of their times, frankly, were pretty sexist. And there are certain things where you read it and go, yeah, when Paul wrote that, I mean, Paul has a reputation among progressive Christians as being fairly misogynistic in a number of times. And there's a lot of problems with some of the things that he wrote. But what was he really trying to get after with the whole of that book is really what we focus more on. I can't speak specifically to that, and that's a whole nother, thing, but that's how we reconcile some of those things. When you read it and go, that's just crazy what he's writing. I mean, there's tons of things like that. It says that, women should stay silent. Our whole concept is that we want to empower people to be their very best at whoever they were, at the person that God created them to be. If we're willing to allow our women to, I shouldn't say it that way. That sounds terrible. I apologize.
I'll tell you what. I get
what you mean.
I think we understand. I think we understand what you're trying to say, and I want to bring Sofia in to comment so far on what you've had to say.
Yeah, so I have like a few different thoughts. Some I'm sure you'd like, some probably not as much. When I think of, I really, first of all, appreciate actually looking at the Bible within context. That's cool, because you're right. Those were very misogynistic times, oftentimes, in which these were said. And I used to be evangelical. I led Bible studies, and then I sort of became a more liberal or progressive Christian for a while. But I took a lot of theology classes. I did a lot of I love contextual criticism, biblical exegesis, that sort of thing. And the more I got into the root of things like what Paul would say or what the Bible was in fact saying, the more it did feel like, oh, it actually is really trying to say what it means here. It is really trying to, it doesn't shy away from the sexism within it, even if we can look back and say that was contextual. And so for me, it became about, I guess, if we want to just sort of take the vibe of the good parts of Christianity, then we can say that it can be more all around supportive of women, but we have to leave the Bible pretty far behind to do that. And I eventually was like, well, if I'm doing that, what's the point if I'm already kind of not really believing the Bible and taking it at face value? Or the more I get into these stories and get to what they are really saying, it still seems pretty sexist. It still seems pretty rough. Am I just leaving the Bible behind and taking God, or taking the parts that I like? How do you respond to that kind of feeling of when you're sort of able to pick and choose the parts that make you feel like it fits into the faith that you have?
Well, that's a completely fair question. And we have everybody that I went to seminary with, we struggle with that very thing. And to be clear, lots of women in my seminary, my two best friends were pastors. That's why I moved to Knoxville with them. They came up here and I came up here with them so they could be pastors. What I would probably say is that I feel like when you are doing that, you're also reducing the gospel and the majesty of the gospel, the beauty of the gospel, to these few things that are sexist, and you're focusing on that as opposed to what even Paul, what he was trying to accomplish, ultimately doing it in a fallible way, but ultimately what he was trying to accomplish, which was to lift up these churches and encourage them to be a community that loved and supported each other. I don't agree with a couple of the ways that he said to do it, but for the most part, I do. So there's that larger context that I believe very much in.
Yeah, I think once I stopped reading with the pre-assumption that you kind of had, because I did come with it thinking, okay, but in general, this is good, right? And I believe in a good God, so the fallible human thing, maybe they messed it up a little bit, but on the whole, when I left that assumption behind, it didn't look nearly like the beautiful message I had believed that it was when I started reading it for just more like an at surface value thing. It's interesting because I was so... Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
If I may, I do want to offer one other small thing that just occurred to me along those lines. To kind of illustrate the issue that we have with Paul, you have the Pauline literature, and then you have the Gospels, the four Gospels. And I actually read a thing once that I thought was really beautifully worded that said that we needed to start, progressive Christians, all Christians, needed to start viewing Paul through the lens of the Gospels and not view the Gospels through the lens of Paul. And basically that's saying that Paul was flawed and we need to stop kind of focusing on his interpretation of everything, but rather see his interpretation through the love and grace of Christ rather than the other way around.
Well, you're giving
theologically, that's very profound.
Yeah, well, I think you're giving a pretty horrible person a pass, right? I mean, you said that Paul has a lot of things that he talks about that you disagree with. He was misogynistic. He was horrible to people, horrible to women. And, he did a lot of horrible things. But because he agrees with the things that you agree with, and forgive me, I'm not trying to sound like I'm attacking you, but let me paraphrase. Let me generalize
here. No, it's good conversation.
It seems to me like, well, you know what? I don't like most of the things or some of the things that Paul did. He really doesn't deserve to get a pass for these atrocities, right? But he's saying something I like, so I'm just going to forget about those other things and consider him credible in this one area. But you got to take the whole person at face value here. Why should we believe Paul or give any kind of credence to Paul? And in the same respect, I would ask you, why should we give credence to the Bible when it lists all of the atrocities that it has, right? Whether it comes down to Abraham forcing his servant to have his child, or Lot, offering his two daughters to a mob of people for them to do whatever they want. We're talking about women here, but it doesn't just stop with women. I mean, there are all kinds of atrocities, committing genocide, keeping the young virgins for yourselves, but murder all the women who have known a man, right? Or God destroying the entire planet, killing hundreds of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people. Why do I have to accept some of the Bible when it's based on this really outdated but also far-reaching, in terms of history, something that goes back and just atrocity after atrocity after hate after genocide, one by one, is this message that you're talking about, this good message, is resting on a foundation of hatred. That's the way that I see it. And now, why should I give Paul a pass, or why should I give the rest of the Bible a pass just because it's got a few good things in it?
That's completely okay question to ask. Here's what I'm going to say. I hope I can remember the three of them now of everything that you said, how I wanted to respond. First of all, I don't think that after Paul became a Christian, I don't consider him as doing these atrocious things. I think that it's a terrible view how much he wanted to demean women, and the fact that he seemed to support slavery because he didn't denounce it. In another one of his books there, but he is a product of his time and the views of those times, which were atrocious. So what I look at is not those specific things where I sit there and go, you are flawed because of this. I look at what is the ultimate point that he's trying to get with all of this, and he's just doing it in a bad way. So I think that you're justified in that question, but I'm going to say that he was a product of his times, and I have to read the Bible in a certain way. Here's the thing, which leads me to my second point. I feel when you talk like that, and again, in the same way, all due respect, I'm not trying to attack you. I'm just trying to illustrate this. Hopefully I'm hitting on something. I feel like you're doing the very same thing that you get frustrated when other Christians call in and do, which is that you're taking everything very literally. You're saying,
well, hold on. All right.
Therefore they did this, and you know what I mean?
I want to address,
maybe that's not fair, but that's
one. I want to address point one first. Okay. God, if God is the moral superiority in our universe, right, then he owes us better than just saying, well, you know what, this is how things happened between 1500 and 2000 BCE. So we're just going to let it slide. Slavery was always wrong, right? Slavery is wrong now, and theoretically it should have been always wrong, especially in the eyes of God, but God did nothing to stop that. The rape of or sexual assault, I should say, hate that R word, forgive me, they're probably going to bleep that out, but the sexual assault of women or young girls, that's always wrong, right? At least it should have been in the eyes of God, but he let that slide. There are so many things where you can point to, well, that was just the way that they did things back then. Well, that's fine, but that doesn't offer it any kind of majesty that you're talking about. That doesn't give it any kind of credibility. If this is the all-powerful, all-kind God, all-loving God, then he owes us better than genocide. He owes us better than, some of the things that I just talked about. And by the way, you had to, when you talk about Paul, you talk about Paul when he turned to Christianity. But what about before that? I mean, Paul was awful before that, and I get it. That message goes to show you, well, even God does good works through people who are considered lost, and you're never kind of out of the way of God, and there's always a chance, this and that, and Christianity should be the way for you. I mean, that kind of thing would attract somebody.
Particular statement there.
But what I want to say is that one second. You can't just say that's the way things were done back then. God should have known better. God, we deserve better if this is our moral our moral compass. But go ahead.
So the way in which you are setting up the nature of God, I'm not going to be able to get a whole lot into this. I don't understand it well enough to explain it all. I know, the basics of what I feel, but is the same way that the right-wing Christians who call in would set up that nature of God. We don't really view it that way. And the fact that Paul was a horrible person before, I don't remember exactly how you said it, but something to the effect that we can't ignore that. The whole premise and what I get when I read the gospel is that we're all pretty bad people periodically.
Oh, we're not. I'm not a bad person.
Rape. Yeah. But no, well, here's what I'm getting at is that I interpret that a little bit differently than you may have. Generally speaking, not always, there's a time for certain selfish behavior, but most of what we would call sin is usually when you're trying to serve yourself as opposed to serving others and helping others and lifting others up. And that is really what it comes down to is that once we, I'm not going to say are saved because I believe that happens 2,000 years ago. It's not something we do. But once we kind of acknowledge that, we try to move toward this idea of being less selfish and more interested in serving one another, serving humanity.
So I have
towards our fellow man.
Jimmy, you want to go and then
No, go ahead, Sophia, please.
I'm getting some hard, I guess in therapy speak, countertransference here with you, because I have made these exact arguments. And when I was looking at it, I realized how much I was straining to reinterpret the Bible to fit what I thought were the good parts of it. And when I finally gave myself permission to not have to justify my belief all the time and actually look at the Bible for what it was fully, first of all, it was a tremendous relief intellectually to not have to do kind of mental gymnastics to make all the Bible work out in a way that is actually positive seeming. But I realized for myself, if I was picking and choosing the Bible this much, why pick the Bible at all? And I think so. I hear a lot of things that I have said, even when it comes to the character of God and things like that. Like, well, I'm not sure about that, but here's this positive thing I take from it. And I absolutely believe that you can take positive things from the Bible. But for me, it lost the feeling of majesty as soon as I felt I didn't have to defend the feeling of majesty anymore. On that, I have 2 recommendations for you, if you're open to that. I don't know.
Sure.
Maybe. Okay. One is a song actually called Sympathy for Paul by Derek Webb, who is I think, left-leaning Christian. And it's sort of about like, what would Paul think of his role in the church today? And I would be really curious to know what you think of that song, because I thought it was actually really interesting and pleasant to listen to. It's just a good song. And the other thing, I know that we don't have like a book club for callers, but I'm so curious to know what you would think of this. It's a book I have called White Too Long. And it's by Robert P. Jones. He is a more liberal Christian, and he's writing about the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. And he talks a lot in the chapter Theology of White Supremacy about the habit of picking and choosing the Bible that people did to affirm what they were doing, and how the modern church does the same thing. And so I would be really curious to know like what you think of that, and how you would draw a distinction between picking and choosing in a way that is positive and doing it in this sort of negative way. Or is it just that we're a more enlightened culture now? So I would really love to know what you think of that, actually. I'm throwing that out there.
Can you give me those two names again, ma'am? Can you give me those two names again?
Oh, ma'am, I love it. Yeah, Sympathy for Paul by Derek Webb is the song. And then I'm going to say White Too Long by Robert P. Jones.
So Matthew, you could always go back to and scroll back and see what we talked about. I just want to kind of summarize everything that we've covered so far. You wanted to call in and give us a perspective of somebody that was a little bit more liberal, not maybe the more stereotypical right-wing evangelical Christian. And I get it. You think that, or I'm not going to say you think, you are attesting that the more liberal Christians, at least the point of view that you take is that you really need to kind of focus on the good parts of what is coming out of Christianity, the overall message, and really the idea is to work toward other people and not just be selfish, right? So I really appreciate that perspective. I want to say that while I don't see much of a difference, right, between that message and the message that any other Christian would give me. I do really appreciate the way that you came in, honestly, spoke with us, and had a mature conversation and didn't yell and scream and do some of the things that you don't like hearing from other Christians, right? Which may be what prompted you to call in the first place. But my problem is this, Matthew. It's that where do you decide what is good in the Bible and what is not? What is going to help your message and what is going to diminish it? If we all stuck to the Bible, we would end up in prison for the things that the Bible tells us to do, or maybe even worse, right? Especially women. Women would be stoned to death for being married and then being found out that they weren't a virgin when they were married, right? Men, that doesn't happen to men, right? So there are some double standards there. But if we were to follow the Bible, it wouldn't be a good thing for us. So how do we decide what's going to be good, what's going to be bad? And do the bad things not discredit the good things? I think that they do. I think the bad things very much discredit the entire message. But more importantly, with all of the disagreements that Christians have, not only with with atheists, but also with other theists, also between themselves, I think God owes us an explanation, and we're just not getting that. And so we have to have these conversations, and we're happy to have them.